and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Lyndall Curtis. The Environment Minister says he's finishing the job started by Paul Keating, creating a comprehensive set of marine parks around Australia, the most comprehensive, he says, in the world. There'll now be a 60-day statutory consultation period on whether the plan should proceed, and the government's announced $100 million of compensation for the fishing industry. Joining me to discuss this and other issues are two Canberra MPs, Liberal Senator Gary Humphries and Labor MP Andrew Leigh. First, we'll go to the Environment Minister's announcement made today.
It's time for the world to turn a corner on protection of our oceans, and Australia today leads that next step with the most comprehensive network of marine parks in the world.
Andrew, the Minister has acknowledged there will be an impact, a significant impact on a small number of people. The Bureau of Agricultural Resource Economics and Sciences has also done studies on the socio-economic impact, but they won't be released until the formal consultation process starts. Shouldn't they be released now?
Well, Lyndall, I think it's important to step back and realise how historic this is. When they were handing out continents, not many countries got one. In fact, we're the only nation that gets a continent of our own. We're now setting about building a network of marine parks that'll be the biggest in the world if this is approved. So that's pretty extraordinary stuff. It's pretty amazing stuff to think that we could leave a legacy to our kids and grandkids that's of the magnitude of the national parks that were left to us by our forebears. So, yes, there'll be conversations around this, but people ought to realise some of the basic facts, that the marine zone doesn't start until 5 kilometres off the shore, so if you're dropping a line in at the edge of the ocean, you're not going to be affected by this. And that, as you mentioned, there's that package of compensation there. But this is really important stuff. It's legacy politics. Tim Winton came and spoke at Parliament a while back, and he talked about the oceans as our family silver, except this is silver that moves as you swim in it. It's a pretty extraordinary thing to be doing, and as the Environment Minister has said, it's a legacy started by Paul Keating, who first recognised that just as we need national parks on the land, we also need national parks in the ocean, because that marine area isn't getting any cleaner. I think everybody agrees that pollution in the oceans is an issue, whether you're a fisher, an environmentalist or both. You recognise that. Gary,
the parks don't necessarily mean there can be no economic activity. There are kind of different zones. That's far from the war on fishing that the Nationals leader Warren Truss has said the government's declared, isn't it?
Well, if that's what it is, but I'm very doubtful about exactly what the government's trying to do here. I mean, we all want to protect our precious reefs and other things about the oceans that are important, but I have to question the motivation behind this move and the timing of the move. Why would a legacy project begun all those years ago by Paul Keating be getting dusted off right now? Is it to do with the fact the government's languishing at subterranean levels in the opinion polls? Is it to do with the fact that Bob Brown's about to retire and they want to sort of try and capture some of the green vote back that might have gone with him? I mean, I'm just very suspicious of the motives of a government which has shown itself all along the way to be prepared to play politics about these sorts of things and to basically
but what do you think of the policy?
Well, the policy is fine if it's based on science. If it's actually a good policy, scientifically examining where you can lock up areas for preservation of the wildlife there, the marine life, where you should be allowing people to continue to access those areas for fishing. Now, has that work been done? I just don't know. I see a government that acts impulsively all the time, makes announcements and then rethinks them, has to unwind policy it's already put on the table because it hasn't properly done the homework. And I suspect this might be again the case in this instance. The question is, what does this government know about the fishing industry in Australia? What are the connections they've got with the fishing industry? I don't know of any Labor members who've got any particular connections with the fishing, the tens of thousands of people employed by the fishing industry in this country. But they've made a decision which affects those people, and I suspect they don't know the full consequences of that. We think we should go back to the drawing board and look at this scientifically based on where those boundaries should be drawn, so you've still got vital and viable fishing industries in Australia, but you also protect the areas which have to be protected.
Andrew, do you think $100 million will be enough money for compensation for industry assistance to the fishing industry?
Lyndall, I think it's the right approach to be taking. I mean, we're certainly engaged now in the detailed conversations about how to deliver that compensation. But I do think that this is really important to continue this process. I mean, it has been a steady process. I talked about Paul Keating before having begun this, but of course the consultations around marine parks continued under John Howard. Extensive consultations. I've met with people on both sides of this who I'm sure will both be frustrated. Some will feel that the area that's been declared is too small, some will feel it's too large. But we're now at the stage where it's not about redrawing lines. A lot of consultation has been done. The question is, do we want to now see the biggest area of marine parks in the world, a legacy to leave our kids? And I spoke before about the conditions of the oceans. Everyone, I think, recognises that Australia's oceans and the world's oceans are not faring well. They have too much junk in them, and that there's areas there that we don't know what is down there. We don't know what we're killing. So one of these marine parks covers a trench which is so deep that we haven't managed to get to the bottom of it. It's pretty extraordinary to think that we're locking up something because we want to preserve the unknown. I think that's legacy politics.
Gary, you said before you have suspicions this isn't based on science, but do you know that for a fact?
Well, I don't know, but I don't think the government knows either. It's made this decision, I think, without the evidence that needs to be put on the table about what exactly it's doing. I mean, it's had consultation, but where's the evidence that they've gone through the science of locking up these areas and not locking up other areas? There's already some evidence that the minister's actually said to people, this is not based on, on a scientific principle. It's based on compensating one part of the state which has lost an area to conservation and making sure other areas are available elsewhere. That kind of talk is very damaging. And to answer the question that Andrew didn't answer, I don't think $100 million is going to be enough. I suspect the Australian fishing industry is going to be much more seriously put out by this. But of course there's no money in the current or in the present budget for next financial year because the government hasn't got money to spend on compensating people who've lost out under this new plan.
Well, we might move on to slightly more murky waters now, to the story that the Prime Minister's office distributed a document telling ministerial staffers how to find information on coalition MPs. This was the reaction from the Prime Minister and the opposition leader.
But I'm indicating to you that I think, scrutiny of things like opposition members buying shares in coal mining companies at the same time that they're running around telling people that coal mining will end in this country, that's a piece of information people are entitled to have.
This is a seriously ethically challenged government, and I think it is typical of this government that a dirt unit should be operating not somewhere in the bowels of Labor Party headquarters, but in the office of the Prime Minister herself.
Gary, advising people on how to find publicly available information is hardly a dirt unit, is it?
Well, it depends what they're looking for and what resources are used to find it. Looking at what's on the public record is fine, but when you're asking ministers to dedicate their staff, staff who ought to be looking at delivering services to the Australian community, not at doing dirt files on the opposition.
But staff are also political, aren't they?
Well, they're political in terms of advising the minister on his or her role. They're not meant to be there, out there sort of collecting dirt. I mean, this is not just about what's on the public record. It's also about things like what members and senators did in their younger days, when they were young people, what they're saying on Twitter and Facebook.
But that's on the public record.
Well, but that's not the kind of thing that I would want my tax dollars to be spent on, particularly when it's been coordinated by the office of the Prime Minister of the land. And the Prime Minister, it ought to be holding a higher standard than that. This is the same Prime Minister, of course, whose staff member organised the riot on Australia Day this year.
Oh, Andrew, is it more embarrassing that the staff need some advice on how to find this information, or that someone leaked it?
Linda, let's be clear about what's acceptable and what's not. If you are talking about someone being consistent in terms of over time, for example, Tony Abbott's supporting a carbon tax, supporting John Howard's emissions trading scheme and then opposing one, then I think that's perfectly appropriate. If you're talking about consistency, like Joe Hockey talking about the age of entitlement and then attacking means tests, again, an issue of consistency. This is about personal lives. I've got no time for it, and I don't think that we ought to be engaged in it. But it is entirely appropriate in public life to look at whether people are being consistent. A tweet these days is pretty much a public statement, and so if someone is saying one thing on Twitter and is saying something else in the Parliament, then that again is a perfectly appropriate issue of consistency.
A question to you both. Ever since I've been reporting on politics, there have been similar units, what was called animals under the Hawke and the Keating government, the government members' secretariat under John Howard, the caucus communications team now. Both the Labor and Coalition have complained about it in opposition, but continued that practice in government. Isn't that just, for a start, the way politics operates and has operated for some time? And aren't both sides a little bit hypocritical because you've both complained about it in opposition and both have continued it in government? First to Andrew.
Well, look, the trend that worries me the most is in the United States there are huge amounts of money now being spent on candidates' personal lives, looking through their relationships, trawling through past lovers and so on. There is no way I want to see us going down that road. But, for example, if a ministerial staffer the other day, for example, drew my attention to Tony Abbott a decade after the dollar's been floated, saying Australia shouldn't have a floating dollar. That is, I think, an appropriate thing for a ministerial staff to draw my attention to. I think it's an appropriate thing for me to mention to you that a decade after one of the huge economic reforms in Australia, Tony Abbott is against it. So I do want to draw that distinction between the personal and the policy.
Well, I think that line is being crossed with this particular exercise. First of all, animals and GMS were sort of offline things. We're now seeing the Prime Minister's office asking ministers to dedicate their own personal resources into this dirt digging, which is a very disturbing development. But it's also obviously...
But how is it different from staffers from both sides of politics walking up into the press gallery with partial transcripts of things people have had to say or newspaper articles from the past? They are people who come up from front benches offices.
Well, look, don't take my word for it. Take the word of those who were quoted on the AM program this morning on the ABC, where we had one minister saying, one senior government figure saying that this was adding activities such as this associated with the Prime Minister's office was wrong. Someone else saying this should be done by the Labor Party, not by the government. And a senior minister, according to the ABC, saying that this is a bad omen for where federal politics is heading. I think they can see this is a bridge too far. This has gone way beyond what's happened in the past, and it should stop.
Andrew, again, is it more damaging for the government that Labor MPs are commenting on these things?
Lyndall, I've always thought it's not appropriate to be commenting off the record. It's not something that I engage in, and I think it distracts from policy. But I would again take you back to the issue of consistency. Gary Humphries campaigned in the 2007 election for an emissions trading scheme. He now argues against a carbon price. So something like that is very much in the public interest.
And we've run out of time. That's where we'll have to leave it. Andrew Lee and Gary Humphries, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lyndall.
Lyndall.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill. Please be with us again tomorrow.